She left him at 20, not because she wanted to, but because she thought he stopped believing in her. She left behind her necklace, her journal, and the love she thought had been a lie. 40 years passed. She built a life, but nothing could prepare her for the day she walked into his world again and found everything still waiting, just as she left it. Beijing, 1965. Victoria Okoye arrived in China with a suitcase of secondhand clothes, a red leather-bound journal, and a heart brimming with conviction. She had never been so far from home, far from her mother's evening songs in Igbo, from her father's radio humming Fela Kuti and Louis Armstrong. But when the scholarship letter came from Tsinghua University, stamped with gold and hope, she didn't hesitate. Beijing was loud and unfamiliar. The language was sharp, the air crisp, and the sky, when the smog lifted, held a quiet, dusty kind of blue. She stood at the university gates with trembling hands tucked into the sleeves of her threadbare coat, reminding herself that this, all of it, was part of the dream. She wasn't here to blend in, she was here to become. The mixer was held 3 weeks after orientation. An intercultural student gathering, the flyer said. Victoria had almost skipped it, unsure if she belonged. But loneliness is a persuasive voice. The ballroom was modest, filled with students in modest suits and modest dresses, laughing in Mandarin, giggling in French. And then she saw him. He wasn't the loudest, not the most handsome, perhaps, but he had a presence like still water. He stood by the wall, a porcelain cup of tea in hand, untouched, tall, impeccably dressed in a black Mandarin collared jacket. His features were sharp but not severe, his gaze unwavering, as if he saw through every layer of performance in the room. Victoria tilted her head, intrigued. He looked like someone who didn't belong here either, but was pretending much better than she was. "You don't drink your tea?" she asked, her voice smooth and melodic, with a subtle Nigerian-American accent. She stood beside him, chin tilted just enough to catch his full attention. He blinked, turned to her slowly, then a small, surprised smile. "I don't trust it," he said, eyes flickering with something dry, almost amused. "I didn't see it poured." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "Is that a rule or paranoia?" "A bit of both," he replied. "And you?" "I'm just here for the free snacks." That earned her a chuckle, a low, quiet sound that felt like a secret being shared. "I'm Jietang," he said after a beat. "Victoria Okoye." They shook hands, and something lingered in the touch. A beat too long, a breath too deep. He wasn't like anyone she'd met before. When they spoke, he didn't rush to fill silences. He allowed them, like pauses in music. Meaningful, intentional. Victoria found herself speaking softly, as if louder words might shatter the strange, delicate thread pulling them closer. He told her he studied engineering and philosophy, a strange pairing. She told him she was studying international relations. "It suits you," he said, observing her with quiet focus. "And why's that?" "You speak like someone who wants to understand the world, but not change yourself for it." She blinked. No one had ever read her that clearly before. That night, after the mixer, he walked her back to the student dorms. The Beijing wind was sharp, tugging at her scarf. They stopped at the courtyard gate. "Will I see you again?" she asked, half teasing, half hopeful. "You'll know where to find me," he said with a faint smile. "Where?" He pointed upward. "The rooftop." It became their sanctuary. By day, it was a forgotten patch of concrete with rusted rails and old cigarette butts. But at night, when the city lights blinked and distant trains rumbled, the rooftop transformed. Victoria brought a blanket and poetry books. Jietang brought dumplings and silence. "You read Neruda?" he asked once, surprised, as she flipped open her worn book of love poems. In 4 languages, she said with a wink. English, French, Spanish, and, painfully, Chinese. He laughed. The sound made her stomach flutter. He would listen while she read aloud. And sometimes, when the mood was right, he would recite something from memory. Ancient Chinese verses, full of longing and sorrow. "I lower my head and think of home," he murmured one night. She turned to him, eyes soft. "Are you homesick?" He shook his head slowly. "I am home when I'm here." They didn't tell anyone, not because they were ashamed, but because the world outside the rooftop wasn't ready. He was the only son of Li Kangwen, founder of Li Industries, a name whispered with reverence, a name stitched into the fabric of Beijing's elite. And she, black, foreign, female, was everything that world feared and rejected. So they stayed hidden. They met at quiet noodle shops, slipped love notes between book pages, stole kisses in the shadows of empty libraries. It was a love that lived between seconds, between breaths, between the cracks of expectation. One rainy night, under a leaking umbrella, Victoria whispered, "Do you think this will last?" Jietang looked at her, his hair soaked, his eyes impossibly tender. "I don't think," he said softly. "I know." Then, cupping her face with trembling fingers, he kissed her like it was the only truth that ever mattered. And for a moment, under the gray Beijing sky, it was. Winter came early that year in Beijing. The rooftop, once their secret Eden, was dusted with frost, the metal rails cold enough to bite. But Victoria still climbed those creaking stairs every other night, wrapped in 2 scarves and an oversized coat Jietang had lent her. It smelled faintly of cedar and ink. Their conversations had grown softer lately, not because the feelings had faded. No, if anything, they deepened. But around them, life kept encroaching. Rumors, whispers, the kind that follow 2 people who were never meant to fall in love. "Come to dinner." Jietang said it casually one afternoon, while they sat shoulder to shoulder in a quiet tea house just off campus. But his voice trembled slightly at the edges. Victoria paused, her chopsticks hovering over a steaming pork bun. "Dinner?" "Yes, with my family," he clarified, eyes not meeting hers. There was a beat of silence between them. Her heart stuttered. She wasn't sure if it was excitement or dread. "Are you sure?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Do they know about me?" "They know you exist," he replied, his gaze finally meeting hers, unwavering. "They just don't know you." Victoria gave a quiet, nervous laugh. "And what exactly do they think I am?" A small muscle in Jietang's jaw ticked. "They think you're a distraction, a novelty." Victoria's smile faltered. He reached across the table and gently took her hand. "But I know the truth, and I want them to see it too." The Li family estate was a temple of quiet power, tucked behind high stone walls, guarded not just by men in suits, but by decades of unspoken rules. Victoria stood in the front hallway, suddenly aware of the sound of her own breathing. Everything was muted. The click of her heels on marble, the hush of distant voices. The walls were hung with ancient calligraphy scrolls and paintings that seemed to look through her. Jietang's mother was the first to greet them. She was elegant in that steel-edged way, like a winter branch that refused to bend. Her cheongsam was navy silk, her hair coiled into a perfect bun. Her eyes swept over Victoria like an appraisal, not a welcome. "You're taller than I expected," she said without smiling. Victoria offered a small bow, polite. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Madame Li." The woman's lips pressed together. "And where is your family from?" "Nigeria," Victoria replied, "though I was raised mostly in the US." A beat. Then, calmly, the mother turned to her son. "I didn't realize you were interested in foreigners." Victoria stiffened. Jietang's fingers brushed hers behind his back. A silent hold on. Dinner was served in stiff silence. The food was exquisite. Sea cucumber and abalone sauce, sweet lotus buns, hand-folded dumplings. But every bite turned to ash in Victoria's mouth. Jietang's father spoke little. He mostly sipped tea and stared, occasionally asking pointed questions. "What are your long-term intentions in China, Miss Okoye? Do your people consider marriage the same way we do?" Victoria answered with grace and clarity, but the words sat like stones between them. It was after dessert, when servants cleared the plates, that she excused herself politely and found her way to the hall. She didn't mean to eavesdrop, but the walls were thin and the voices sharp. "She's not one of us," Madame Li said, her voice cold. "She's educated. She's brilliant. She carries herself with dignity," Jietang argued. "None of that changes what she is," his father added. "A foreign woman with no blood ties, no place in this family's future." "She's not a business deal," Jietang snapped. "She's a liability. The press will ask questions. Shareholders will panic. Do you want to drag scandal through our name for a phase?" There was a pause. Then Madame Li said softly, "You're not a boy anymore, Jietang. You know what's at stake." Victoria stepped back, her chest tight, throat aching, her vision blurred. She hadn't realized how much she needed their approval, how deeply she had hoped that love would be enough. He found her outside, in the garden, sitting on the stone bench beneath a skeletal plum tree. The frost shimmered across its bare branches like glass veins. She didn't look up as he approached. "They hate me," she murmured. "No," he said gently. "They fear you." Victoria turned to him, eyes shining but fierce. "I don't want to be someone you have to defend." "I'm not defending you," he said, crouching in front of her. "I'm protecting us." Her voice cracked. "I don't want to be your rebellion." "You're not." He reached for her hand, pressing it to his chest. "You're the reason I breathe differently now. You made me feel alive, for the first time since I was a child being measured against a dynasty." Victoria looked at him then, and for the first time that night, she let herself believe him. "I will fight for us," he whispered, forehead pressed to hers. "Even if it's just me, even if I lose everything." She closed her eyes, leaned into his warmth, into the quiet, unshakable strength of him. And in the still, frozen garden of a house built on power and tradition, a different kind of vow was made, unspoken, but unforgettable. Spring had begun to thaw the edges of Beijing's icy streets. Cherry blossoms bloomed shyly along the garden paths of Tsinghua, and sunlight filtered through the windows of the International Library where Victoria often studied. She was bent over a worn copy of The Art of War, translating notes into a journal she shared with Jietang. They had been talking about building a life together, whispers of what-ifs and maybes that sometimes became midnight plans. A quiet home in the countryside, lectures at the university, a world where love was enough. But under the soft petals of spring, something darker began to bloom. It started with a man named Chen Hao. He was charming in a loud, oily sort of way, always too familiar with Victoria when they crossed paths in the university corridors. She tolerated him only out of politeness, always making sure she never lingered too long in his company. She didn't know he'd been hired. The Li family, afraid Jietang might actually walk away from the empire for her, crafted a story cruel enough to sever even the deepest bond. Chen Hao was instructed to approach Victoria after class, to feign familiarity, to engineer a moment. He invited her to a public lecture on global diplomacy. She declined. He pretended to stumble into the library when she was alone. She offered him a polite nod and returned to her reading. He tried again, this time saying he'd found her bracelet, which he had actually stolen a week before. She smiled cautiously and took it back. And that was when the photographer struck, hiding behind the courtyard garden. The picture looked intimate, not romantic, but close enough to twist. 3 days later, Jietang received a thick envelope. It was delivered not to his campus mailbox, but to his private flat in the city, a place only his family knew. Inside were 8 photographs, blurry, grainy, but damning. Victoria accepting a bracelet from a man with his hand briefly on hers. Another image of them seated in the library, her head bent near his, though she was reading her own book. And worst of all, an altered image of Victoria entering the lobby of a hotel alone, with a timestamp that matched the evening she had told Jietang she was running errands. He stared at the images in silence. His hands trembled, but not from belief, from rage. He knew her. He knew her. Victoria was the most honest person he had ever met. She blushed when she told white lies. She cried when stray cats were shooed off the street. This wasn't real. Jietang arrived at her dorm flat just after sunset. He didn't knock gently. He pounded, holding a manila envelope in his hand and a storm behind his eyes. Victoria opened the door, startled. Jietang! He stepped inside, handed her the envelope. These were sent to me. She opened it, confused, and her face went pale. Photos, blurry, misleading. Her accepting her bracelet from Chen Hao. The cafe where they'd sat near each other, never touching. And the worst one, altered, but damning, of her walking into the lobby of a hotel alone. Her hands trembled. Jietang! He stepped forward. Victoria, he said quietly, firmly, look at me. She did. I don't believe them. Her eyes flooded instantly. I know who you are, he said. I know your heart. And I know you wouldn't betray me. I just needed you to see what they're capable of. She broke into sobs, clutching the envelope to her chest. I swear, I would never. He pulled her into his arms and held her tightly. I know, he whispered into her hair. I know. I believe you. Jietang arrived at the Lee estate the next day. His father was reading the paper. His mother was pouring tea. He dropped the photos on the table between them like broken glass. This is how far you're willing to go? Madame Lee didn't blink. It's for your future. This is criminal, Jietang hissed. This is manipulation. His father set the newspaper aside calmly. It's correction. You were straying too far. We only brought you back. Jietang stared at them, his hands clenching. You think this will make me walk away from her? It already has, Madame Lee said coldly, or it will. Victoria, reassured by Jietang's words, felt peace return. That night, she stopped by his flat. She hadn't told him. She just wanted to surprise him. She brought a small paper bag filled with his favorite sesame buns from the corner stall and the little journal they'd been writing love notes in. She was humming to herself, barefoot, when she saw the front door open. And then, his voice, low, wounded, talking on the phone, not knowing she was there. How could she do this to me? Jietang whispered into the receiver. I trusted her. I loved her. Victoria froze behind the wall, her heart cracking like thin ice. He thinks I cheated. The paper bag slipped from her hand, unnoticed. He thinks I betrayed him. She didn't hear the rest. She didn't wait to find out who he was talking to. His cousin, who was feeding him more of the fabricated story. She didn't hear him say, I know it's a lie. I know my family made this happen, but I don't know how to fix it. I don't know if she'll forgive me for not protecting her. Because Victoria had already slipped out the back door. He ended the call an hour later. The buns were on the counter, untouched. The lights were dimmed, and on his desk, folded in two, was a single piece of notepaper, their shared journal torn from the binding. His fingers trembled as he opened it. If this is how little you see me, there's nothing left. Don't come looking. Not this time. Vicky! His breath left him. No. He called her name, but she was gone. She didn't go back to her dorm. She couldn't. Instead, she walked through the streets of Beijing, past vendors closing up for the night, past couples holding hands, past a bookstore where she and Jietang once stood in the poetry aisle, reading Neruda. The wind bit through her coat, but she didn't feel it. It wasn't just the idea that he didn't trust her. It was that she had trusted him, truly, fully, with everything in her. And now, it felt like all of it had been dangling on a thread. She found herself in a cafe just after midnight, sitting at a corner table alone, tea going cold in front of her. She kept replaying his voice in her head. How could she do this to me? It echoed, warped, became her own. How could I think this would last? How could I let myself fall? Tears streamed down her face in silence. No one looked at her. No one asked. That made it worse. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she packed her suitcase with slow, mechanical movements. Her hand lingered on the necklace he'd given her, the one she'd taken off the night he held her and told her he believed her. She clutched it in her fist until her knuckles went white, and then she dropped it on his desk, a parting, a surrender. At the airport, she sat by the window, staring blankly at the tarmac. The boarding call came. She didn't move, not at first. Her eyes were red, her face pale. Her chest felt hollow, like something had been scooped from inside her and left gaping. She held nothing now but her passport and a broken heart. And when she finally boarded the flight home, she looked back only once, toward a skyline that had once held all her hope. Then she turned away. In the apartment she left behind, Jietang sat on the floor in the same clothes she'd once straightened for him, surrounded by absence and shame. The rooftop grew cold again after that, untouched, unvisited. The cherry blossoms wilted under sudden frost, and love, once so close to blooming, was buried once more beneath misunderstanding. Somewhere across the sea, a young woman sat on a plane with eyes that had forgotten how to shine, holding nothing but silence, and a love she believed had been nothing but a mirage. The flat was too quiet. For a long time, Jietang didn't move. He just stood there, the note still open in his hand, reading it again as if somehow the meaning would shift if he stared hard enough. But it didn't. The words were still there. If this is how little you see me, there's nothing left. And the signature that had once made him smile whenever she scribbled it in the margins of their shared journal, Vicky, now felt like the sharp edge of a blade. He called her name into the silence. Victoria. Nothing answered. Just the soft tick of the wall clock and the aching hum in his chest. He didn't sleep that night, or the next. He searched everywhere. He started with the university campus, combing through the dormitories. Have you seen Victoria Okoye? He had asked again and again, in Chinese, in English. A few students shrugged. One girl said, "She withdrew from her classes this morning." His blood ran cold. This morning? He sprinted to the registrar's office, nearly colliding with the security guard. The clerk at the front desk blinked at him, startled. "She left a formal withdrawal letter," the woman said, flipping through files. "Said it was a family emergency. She gave up her housing and scholarship." Jietang's voice cracked. Did she say where she was going? The woman hesitated, only that she needed to go home. Next, he went to her old dorm room. It was already half cleared, the sheets stripped, drawers open. Some notebooks remained, but nothing personal. Nothing that carried her scent. No scarf draped over the chair. No tea mug by the window. Except, on the desk, beneath a small envelope labeled, in her neat cursive, to be donated, was the necklace he had given her. The one with the simple gold pendant in the shape of a ginkgo leaf. She had worn it every day for the past 6 months. He picked it up slowly, reverently. The chain was still warm from sunlight, untouched, unworn, and suddenly it hit him. She left it because she didn't want to carry anything that reminded her of me. His knees buckled and he sat on the edge of the bed, cradling the necklace in his palm. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. He tore through the city like a man chasing a dream that was already fading. His coat half buttoned, his car abandoned at the curb. He only knew one thing. She was leaving. He had no flight number, no airline, no goodbye, but the silence in his apartment screamed it. And so he drove as fast as he could to Beijing Capital International Airport. By the time he arrived, Terminal 3 was already pulsing with life. Red-eye passengers with heavy eyes and heavier hearts, workers sweeping behind counters, and flight numbers flickering on the massive departure board like seconds ticking away. He scanned the list. New York, Los Angeles, Atlanta, Chicago. Which one? He darted to the counter, heart pounding. Victoria Okoye, he said breathlessly. Can you check if she's on any outbound flights? Please, it's urgent. The attendant frowned. I'm sorry, sir. I can't release that information. He checked every terminal, walked every gate, asked every face. Nothing. He was about to give up when he heard it. Final boarding call for United Airlines, Flight 882 to New York City. He turned sharply. Terminal 3, Gate 38. He ran. But by the time he arrived, the doors were already sealed. Behind the glass, he could see the walkway retracting, the plane pulling back from the gate. Slow, steady, merciless. He moved to the window, stared as the plane rolled down the tarmac. Somewhere in that cabin, she might be watching the same twilight sky, her eyes red, her heart breaking, her seatbelt fastened not just to her body, but to the decision she believed she had to make. He pressed his hand against the window and whispered, "Don't go." But she was already gone. Back at his apartment, the silence was unbearable. He sat on the edge of his bed, her note beside him. If this is how little you see me, there's nothing left. 2 days later, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through old records until he found a number. Her family's landline. He called, long distance. After a few rings, a soft voice answered. Hello. He recognized it. Is this Victoria's sister? Yes. This is Jietang. A beat. Then, she's home. But she doesn't want to talk to anyone right now. He closed his eyes, trying not to shatter. I missed her. By minutes. At the airport. She didn't want to be found. I know, but I need to say something. Just one thing. The line stayed silent, but didn't hang up. I didn't believe the photos, he said, voice cracking. I confronted my family. I told her I trusted her. He paused. She overheard something. Something I said on the phone. She thought I meant her. She misunderstood. And now she's gone. The voice softened. She's very hurt, Mr. Lee. I know, but I need her to know something. He swallowed hard. Tell her I never stopped trusting her, and I never stopped loving her. Silence again. Then, just before the line clicked, I'll tell her. The apartment felt colder after that. He walked to the desk where she left the necklace. He picked it up, clutched it in his fist, and sank to the floor, still in the clothes she once smoothed for him with gentle fingers. The rooftop grew colder again after that. Untouched, unvisited. The cherry blossoms that had once danced in spring wilted under sudden frost. He returned to her flat that night, still holding the ginkgo leaf necklace. The bed was made. The journals still lay open on the desk, their final entry written in her hand. "Do you think we'll ever be a story worth telling?" "Only if we end up together," he had replied. She had laughed and written below, "Then we'll just have to make sure we do." His hands trembled, but he didn't cry. He was too hollow for tears. Jietang placed the necklace into a carved wooden box and locked it. He put the journal beside it, and he swore, aloud, to the ceiling, to the silence, there won't be another. Not because he couldn't move on, but because he didn't want to. Not if it wasn't her. She had been his spring, his rebellion, his only softness in a world of stone and steel. And now she was gone. Shanghai, present day. At 60 years old, Li Jietang had everything. A billion-dollar empire, columns in Forbes Asia, property on 4 continents, a name whispered with reverence in the highest echelons of business and diplomacy. He was a man known for his silence, strategic, elegant, immovable. His suits were tailored in Milan, his decisions calculated with surgical precision. No scandal had ever touched him. No love story had ever followed him, because he'd buried that part of himself in the Beijing snow decades ago. Only one woman had ever mattered, and she had become his ghost. The ballroom shimmered in gold and ivory, chandeliers dripping with crystal light. It was a charity gala hosted by the Shanghai Global Women's Foundation, honoring humanitarian leaders who had spent their lives in service. Jietang hadn't planned to attend. He didn't go to events like these unless he was presenting a check or shaking hands with the head of state. But his assistant had insisted this one required his presence. The company had donated generously. His name was on the sponsor banner. "You don't have to stay long," the assistant had said, "just long enough to be seen." So he came, late, distant, alone. He stood near the back, nursing a glass of untouched wine. The room was filled with murmurs and camera flashes, silk gowns and designer tuxedos. Somewhere in the background, a quartet played a slow, aching version of Moon River. He had just begun to plan his quiet exit when he heard the MC say, "And now, please welcome one of our distinguished honorees, a woman whose work with refugee education and women's literacy has changed thousands of lives across 3 continents." He barely registered the words, until the name, Dr. Victoria Okoye. The air was suddenly gone from the room. He didn't breathe. He didn't move. She walked out onto the stage in a deep green dress that flowed like forest silk. Her posture was regal, her steps slow but sure. There were silver streaks in her coiled hair now, and the years had softened her, not aged her. Grace had etched itself into her skin. The crowd clapped politely, but Jietang heard nothing but the sound of his heartbeat roaring in his ears. His hand gripped the edge of his glass so tightly he thought it might shatter. She was here. She was alive. She was real. Victoria stood at the podium with practiced ease, smiling gently as she adjusted the mic. "I'm honored to be here," she said, her voice still honey and velvet, only richer now. "But the truth is, most of the women I work with couldn't care less about awards. They want clean water, safe streets, and the right to read their child a bedtime story." She paused, glancing down at her notes. Then she looked up, and her eyes found him. Across the sea of guests, across the decades, and stopped, For a moment, the world tilted. Time folded in on itself. She didn't smile, didn't blink, just looked. And in that one gaze, everything came rushing back. The rooftop, the dumplings, the necklace, the last note. He watched her throat tighten. She looked away too quickly, but the damage had already been done. He waited. When her speech ended, he didn't move as the crowd stood and applauded. When she stepped down from the stage, surrounded by women in bright scarves and donors with firm handshakes, he made his way quietly through the room, silent as shadow. He found her by the refreshment table, speaking with the translator. She saw him before he spoke. Her fingers tightened on her glass. "Victoria," he said, softly, reverently. She turned, and for a moment she didn't speak. Then, carefully, Jietang. He smiled faintly. "You haven't called me that in 40 years. She raised a brow. "What should I call you now? Mr. Billionaire?" There was a sharpness to her voice, but not cruelty. It was armor, polished and necessary. He stepped closer. "You look exactly as I imagined." "Older?" she said, one corner of her mouth twitching. "Unforgettable," he replied. A beat passed. "Why are you here?" she asked. "I didn't know you would be," he said truthfully. "I wouldn't have come if I had." She blinked. "Why not?" "Because I'm not sure my heart could survive it." Silence stretched between them. Then she exhaled, looking away. "It's been a lifetime." "Too long," he whispered. Victoria turned back to him, her eyes glassy but dry. "There's a version of us that never let go, that stayed in Beijing and fought the whole world, that believed love was enough." He swallowed hard. "Do you still believe it might be?" "I don't know," she said. "I don't know who you are anymore, and I don't know if I want to know." It hurt, but he nodded. "I understand." She turned as if to walk away, then hesitated. "There's something I left behind," she said quietly. Jietang looked at her, his voice gentle. "I know." "I couldn't take them with me," she whispered. "Not the necklace, not the journal. They were too full of you." He took a breath, deep and slow. "I kept them." She looked at him sharply. "I kept everything," he said. "The necklace, it's still in the drawer beside my bed. The journal, it's open to your last words." Victoria blinked, swallowing the emotion rising in her throat. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you hold on to them?" His voice broke slightly. "Because they were the only proof I hadn't imagined all of it. That you were real. That what we had was real." She stepped closer. "And you never..." "I never wore the necklace. I never wrote in the journal. I couldn't. They weren't mine. They were yours." The silence that followed was sacred. Then a call came from behind her. One of her colleagues. Victoria turned her head, then back to him. "I should go." He nodded, stepping back. But before she walked away, she touched his hand. Just once, lightly, like brushing dust off an old book, and said, "Some ghosts never really leave us, do they?" "No," he said softly. "They become the parts of us that don't age." She held his gaze for a final second, and then she was gone. 2 days had passed since the Shanghai gala. He had not reached out. She hadn't expected him to. And yet, Victoria found herself folding the same green dress she wore that night a dozen times, putting it in the closet, taking it out, wondering if he had meant what he said. "I'm not sure my heart could survive it." She didn't plan to look for him, but something about the way he looked at her, like time itself had bowed before her, unraveled threads she thought were long buried. The message came in the form of a hand-delivered letter. Elegant calligraphy, cream-colored envelope, no return address. Inside, it read simply, "There is a tea house near the old French concession. One you once said reminded you of the courtyard where we first read Neruda together. I will be there at 10 a.m. on Saturday. Only if you want to come. Jietang." She stared at the note for several long minutes, her fingers trembling, and then she folded it once, tucked it into her journal. The tea house was quiet and old, tucked between ivy-covered walls and shaded by wisteria. It smelled of jasmine and earth, and a kind of stillness that rarely survived modern life. Victoria arrived 10 minutes early. She had worn soft linen trousers and a cream blouse, something neutral, unassuming. But when she caught her reflection in the carved wooden panel near the door, she adjusted her earrings and whispered under her breath, "You're not that girl anymore." She wasn't, but some part of her heart still carried her. He was already seated when she entered, by the window, alone, a steaming pot of Longjing tea between two ceramic cups. He rose when he saw her, not smiling, but his eyes lit up like dawn breaking across winter fields. "Victoria!" "Jietang!" She sat opposite him, careful not to meet his gaze too fully. They poured tea in silence. The air felt too still, too pressed under years of unsaid things. He looked older, yes, but not diminished. The silver in his hair only added gravity to the lines of his face. But his hands, those were still the same. Long fingers, still, controlled. Trembling slightly now as he lifted his cup. "How have you been?" he asked gently. She gave a soft breath of a laugh. "That's where we're starting?" His lips curved barely. "I didn't know where else to begin." She sipped the tea. It was hot, floral, and bitter. "I've been alive. And you?" "Existing," he said, "for a long time, until recently." Another silence fell. Not hostile, just heavy. Victoria set down her cup and looked at him directly for the first time. Her voice was even, but her eyes burned. "I thought you believed them." The words hung in the air like smoke. Jietang's face crumpled, just slightly, but it was enough. His eyes closed for a moment as though they hurt to keep open. "I didn't," he whispered. "I never did." She swallowed. "You said it. I heard you. How could she do this to me?" "I wasn't speaking to condemn you. I was grieving. I was angry, but not at you." His voice trembled now. "I knew it was a lie. I knew it the moment I saw the photos." "Then why didn't you come after me?" "I did," he said, barely able to hold her gaze. "I called. I went to your dorm. I stood at the airport and watched your plane disappear into the sky." Victoria blinked, stunned. "I thought you hated me. I thought you didn't fight." He exhaled sharply, like the wind had been knocked from him. "Victoria, I was 20 years old, and I had never felt powerless until the day I lost you. I thought loving you would be enough. I didn't realize what it would cost us both." She looked down, her fingers tightening around her teacup. "I waited for you," she whispered, "for years, even when I told myself I wasn't." He reached across the table, slowly, and gently placed his hand over hers. Not gripping, just touching, like anchoring. "I waited too," he said, "my entire life." They sat like that for a long time. No need for grand speeches. The silence between them now felt different. Not empty, but full. Full of memories and pain and something dangerously close to hope. "I don't know if I can go backward," she said quietly. "I'm not asking you to," he replied. "I want to know who you are now, not just who you were." Victoria looked out the window at the falling wisteria. "I'm guarded, wiser, maybe harder to love." Jietang smiled faintly. Then let me learn again. A long pause. She looked back at him, eyes wet but clear. I don't promise anything, she said. I'm not asking for promises, he said. Only a beginning. When they finally stood to leave, he paid for the tea without comment. Outside, the spring air was cool and damp. Victoria pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. I forgot how Shanghai smells after rain. He looked at her and nodded. You remembered a lot of things then. She hesitated. Then, softly, yes, I did. They stood for a moment longer, facing each other. Then she gave him a small, cautious smile. I'll see you again? He didn't smile, but his voice was sure. Yes, you will. And with that, she turned and walked down the stone path, not back into his life completely, but not away from it either. They met 3 more times after the tea house. Small things, nothing grand. A walk along the Bund at dusk, a quiet museum visit in the French concession. Talking, learning each other again, carefully, like feeling for familiar walls in the dark. Victoria was cautious, her heart scarred in places she didn't know how to name, but she didn't say no when he asked if she'd come see the new art gallery he was opening, a philanthropic wing dedicated to emerging artists from underserved countries. She didn't say no when he asked if she could stay afterward, just to talk. And that's how she found herself, one rainy Sunday, in his penthouse overlooking the Huangpu River. Everything was sleek, elegant, minimal, except for the one box he kept beneath the bookshelf, worn, wooden, and covered in years of dust. She spotted it by accident. I see even billionaires still have a place for old clutter, she teased gently, pointing toward the box tucked behind volumes of philosophy and economic theory. Jietang followed her gaze and stilled. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then slowly, quietly, he walked over and pulled the box out. This isn't clutter, he said. It's you. He placed it on the low glass table and knelt beside it, almost reverently. Victoria frowned. What do you mean? Jietang opened the lid. Inside were dozens of envelopes stacked neatly, all aged differently, some yellowing at the edges, others fresher, all of them addressed in his handwriting, all of them bearing the same name, Victoria Okoye. She reached for one near the top and turned it over. Her breath caught. October 12th, 1973. Dear Vicky, I thought I saw you in the market today. It wasn't you, but I turned around so fast I nearly dropped my tea. You're still the reflex I can't unlearn. Her fingers trembled. What is this? I wrote you, he said softly. Every year. On your birthday. Sometimes on mine. On days when I couldn't sleep. When I was scared I would forget the sound of your laugh. I wrote to you because I didn't know where else to put the love. Victoria stared at the letters. There were dozens, possibly more. She couldn't breathe. You never sent them. I didn't know where to send them, he said. You left so completely. Your family refused contact, and I thought, maybe you'd built a life you didn't want interrupted. She looked up at him then, eyes red, face tight. Why didn't you fight harder? The words cracked like thunder. Jietang's shoulders slumped, the weight of a lifetime dragging him down. I was 20, and proud, and broken. You left without a word, and I thought you hated me, that I'd failed you. You did fail me, she whispered, her voice trembling. Tears welled in her eyes as she held a letter from 1980. Happy birthday, Victoria. Are you married now? Do your children look like you? I hope they do. I hope someone is loving you better than I ever managed to. Her chest heaved. She pressed the paper to her lips and shook her head. You don't get to say that. You don't get to disappear and then ask me to believe you never stopped loving me. I didn't disappear, he said quietly. You did. And I let you, because I thought I'd already lost you. She stood abruptly, walking to the window, gripping the frame with both hands. The Shanghai skyline blinked in gold and steel, rain streaking the glass. I was 20, she said, her voice quieter, and I'd just given everything to someone who said he'd fight. But when I walked away, all I heard was silence. He stood behind her now. I wasn't silent, he murmured. I was screaming into empty space, but I didn't know where to send my voice. She turned, and her eyes, still fierce, still wet, met his. You should have found me. He nodded slowly. Yes, I should have. They sat together again, later, both staring at the box of letters spread out like fallen leaves between them. Victoria picked up one from 1997. It's your birthday today. I imagine you in a long silk dress, laughing. I wish I could hear it again. God, I miss the sound of you. Do you still write them? She asked. No, he said. Not after I saw you at the gala. That night broke the loop. Why? Because I realized I didn't have to imagine anymore. She was quiet for a long time, then reached out and placed her hand over his. Jietang, she said softly, I don't know where this ends. I do, he said. It ends with me never letting you walk away again. She swallowed hard, her voice breaking. I'm scared. We've lived whole lives apart. We're not the same people. I know, he said, but the part of me that loved you then, that part never changed. And then, in a room full of old words, they finally let the silence rest. Not the kind born from distance or pride, but the kind that said, we are still here. The box of letters stayed on Victoria's coffee table for nearly a week. She couldn't bring herself to put it away. Each morning, she'd sit beside it with her tea, sometimes opening one, sometimes not. Just knowing it was there, that she had been there in the corners of Jietang's heart all those years, unraveled something carefully guarded inside her. She didn't say yes to love again, not yet, but she said yes to time. Time to see what might still be waiting for them. Time to talk, to remember, to hope. Carefully. They had dinner together now. Quiet ones, intimate. Sometimes in his home, where soft music played on vintage speakers. Sometimes in small restaurants with dim lighting and thick curtains, where no one bothered them and everything felt suspended in its own soft reality. One night, they sat on his balcony, Shanghai glittering beneath them. I used to dream about this, he said, offering her a small plate of fruit. About the fruit, she teased. He chuckled. About you being here, with me, looking at the city, like we were never interrupted. She looked at him, eyes gentle. But we were. He nodded. I know. And then he reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together. But we're here now. It came on a Tuesday afternoon. Jietang had just wrapped a board meeting when his nephew, Li Chen, cornered him in the hallway of the executive tower. Chen was sharp, ambitious, the new golden boy of the Li conglomerate. He'd always resented Jietang's quiet dominance, always waited for a misstep. She's bad for optics, Chen said coolly, stepping in front of the elevator door. The shareholders are murmuring. Some donors are pulling back from the education initiative. Jietang's face didn't move. And? Chen folded his arms. And if this relationship becomes public, we'll lose our Singapore contracts. Our political allies in Chengdu are already pressuring for clarity. He handed over a glossy folder. Inside, photos of Victoria at various events. A headline draft, Li Jietang's second act, love affair with foreign widow raises questions. He didn't open it. Chen leaned closer. We can bury it, quietly. If you step away from her, let it fade. There was a pause. And then, very slowly, Jietang spoke, his voice like quiet thunder. "Do you know what I buried 40 years ago?" Chen blinked. "Excuse me?" Jietang stepped forward, the weight of his age and power settling over his nephew like a winter storm. "I buried my heart, my future, the only real joy I've ever known, all to protect a family name built on control and cowardice. And I am done." Chen straightened. "You're willing to throw it all away? For her?" And Jietang said, calm and cold, "Then let it burn." Victoria found him waiting outside her apartment later that evening. He didn't knock, just stood under the archway, drenched in golden dusk light, his hands in his pockets, looking like a man walking out of a long war. She opened the door and stepped out. "Jietang, I need to tell you something," he said. Her heart sank. "What is it?" He handed her the folder. She opened it slowly. Her fingers tightened. Her photo. A summary of her marriage. A write-up of her charity work, twisted with insinuation. "I thought I'd buried this part of your world," she whispered. "I did too," he said. She looked up at him. "They'll use this. They'll shame you." "I know," he said. "And your empire, your name." He stepped closer. "I'm not asking for your permission to love you," he said, voice steady. "I'm telling you I already do. And if they want to take everything from me for it, they can." "Why now?" she whispered. "Why are you willing now when you weren't before?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Because losing you once nearly broke me. Losing you again would kill me." She didn't answer him right away. She simply leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his chest, just like she had in that Beijing garden so many decades ago. He wrapped his arms around her. Neither said the word love, not yet, but they no longer needed to. Because when the storm rose again, they would face it together, this time without hiding. The invitation came quietly, as most important things between them now did. "I'd like you to see something," Jietang said one morning, as they walked through a sculpture exhibit. His hand brushed hers lightly. Not quite a request, not quite a command. "It's outside the city, about 2 hours away." Victoria raised a brow. "Another gallery?" He smiled faintly. "Not quite." They drove out early the next Saturday, the city slowly melting into rolling hills and quiet skies. The car hummed with warmth and soft conversation. Occasionally they'd lapse into silence. Comfortable now, like shared breath. Victoria watched the scenery shift outside the window. She hadn't seen this part of China in years. Villages with old tiled roofs, rice paddies stretching into the distance. Her chest ached with nostalgia, not for the place, but for the time it held. They passed through a narrow gate just after noon. The road curved around a small hill, where trees rustled in the wind and a quiet estate nestled like a secret. "Where are we?" she asked. Jietang didn't answer immediately. Instead, he parked beneath a row of ginkgo trees, tall and golden, their fan-shaped leaves fluttering like falling prayers. And then he turned to her, his voice low. "Do you remember the garden behind your old dorm in Beijing? The one you said made you feel like you were walking through poetry?" She blinked. "Of course! I rebuilt it." The moment she stepped through the gate, Victoria felt something shift inside her. It was almost identical. A stone path winding between plum trees and wild camellia. A quiet koi pond that glimmered with sunlight. Bamboo swaying gently in the breeze. "It's not perfect," he said behind her, "but I tried to remember everything you loved." Her eyes stung. He had remembered the lilac bush, the old stone bench, even the tiny arch bridge that she used to cross slowly, pretending she was in an old Chinese painting. And then she saw it, half hidden beneath an old magnolia tree. The gnarled bark was thicker now, older, but the carving remained, weathered but legible, with the initials J plus V. Her breath caught. "You didn't—" "I came back a year after you left," he said, "and I carved it deeper, so time wouldn't erase it." She turned to face him. His eyes were soft, unapologetic. "I never stopped loving you," he said simply. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she stepped closer to the tree, tracing the initials with the pad of her thumb. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I thought it would all be gone. I never could destroy the place where I last saw you happy." She looked at him then, really looked. And it wasn't just Jietang she saw. It was the boy who had waited on the rooftop with dumplings, the man who wrote letters year after year, the soul who had carried her name in his chest like a talisman. "I was afraid this would be too late," she said, "that there'd be too much we'd forgotten." "There's nothing I forgot," he said, "only things I never got to say." He reached for her hand, then, slowly, reverently, like she was something sacred, and she let him. Their fingers fit together like they never learned how to let go. They sat together on the old bench, the tree behind them like a guardian. "I've lived a good life," she said after a while, "but not a full one." He nodded. "I built a world, but it never felt like mine." She looked down at their hands. "Do you think we could still begin again?" "I don't want a beginning," he said, voice thick. "I want a continuation of what was never truly over." She let her head rest against his shoulder. "I want slow mornings," she whispered. "I want to read poems with you again. I want to laugh without wondering if it's allowed." "You can have all of that," he said, "and more." And then he turned his head, gently, and pressed a kiss to her temple. Soft, sure, and unspeakably tender. That evening, they walked the garden path as the sun melted into amber. He pointed out the small cottage he was restoring near the edge of the estate. "It has a writing desk," he said, "just beneath the window, in case you want to finish that book you once told me about." Her heart cracked open. "You remembered that?" "I remember everything," he said. And he did, because some love stories aren't about fireworks or grand declarations. Some love stories are about quiet choices, about waiting, about hands still reaching after 40 years. The night was unusually still. The countryside hummed with the faint chorus of cicadas and the rustling of bamboo in the garden breeze. Lanterns lined the path behind the house, casting soft amber light that flickered against the windows. Inside the cottage, Victoria stood by the open door, sipping from a ceramic cup of chrysanthemum tea. She wore a simple linen robe, no makeup, no effort, just herself, bare, calm, uncertain. Jietang watched her from the small table where he had laid out a plate of mooncakes they hadn't touched. She hadn't spoken in a while, not since they returned from the garden, but something still hung in the air between them, unspoken. He waited, and finally, she said softly, "I should tell you about David." Jietang nodded slowly. "Your husband." "My ex-husband," she corrected. "He passed 8 years ago." He lowered his gaze. "I'm sorry." "I married him 5 years after I left China," she said, her voice like silk drawn over old stone. "He was kind, gentle, a quiet schoolteacher. He made me feel safe when I didn't believe in romance anymore." She paused, eyes misting over. "I did love him, but not like—" She hesitated. "Not like I loved you." Jietang's throat tightened. He didn't speak. "I never told him," she went on, "about what happened here. Not the whole truth. I think a part of me always kept that piece of myself locked away. Sacred, maybe selfish." She turned to him then. I tried to build something new. I really did. But every birthday, I wondered if you remembered me. Every spring, when plum trees bloomed, I felt it all over again. A tear slid down her cheek and she didn't wipe it away. I didn't mean to hold on to you, she whispered, but I did. Jietang stood then, walking slowly toward her. And I held on to you, he said, even when I became a man the world respected, even when the empire grew, even when the headlines called me invincible. He stopped a breath away from her. I had all the money, the power, the reverence, but I never had peace. Victoria looked up at him, eyes glistening. Why didn't you let go? His answer was quiet, sure, because loving you never felt like a phase I needed to survive. It felt like the only part of me that was real. She set her tea down on the windowsill, and they stood in the low golden light, years collapsing between them. I think, she said softly, what hurts the most is how much time we lost. How many seasons passed while we were angry, or proud, or scared. He reached for her hand, taking it gently in his. Her fingers curled around his like they'd always belonged there. And she said it, through a tight breath, we wasted so much time. He looked at her then, really looked at her, not with regret, but with clarity. And he answered, without hesitation, then let's not waste a second more. She fell into him then, not like someone swooning, but like someone returning to a place they'd been aching to come home to. He wrapped his arms around her, and for a long time, they just stood there, breathing in the decades, letting the pain, the shame, the grief melt between their bodies. I was angry with you for years, she whispered into his shoulder. I told myself you let me go too easily. I didn't, he murmured, but I didn't know how to fight for something that had already disappeared. She pulled back just enough to look into his eyes. You have me now, she said, if you still want me. He cupped her face with both hands, reverent and awestruck, as though she were something fragile and holy. I've only ever wanted you. Later, they sat by the hearth in quiet contentment. She leaned against his side, his arm around her shoulder, her head resting just beneath his chin. He reached over and took her hand again. I want to give you what I couldn't give you then, he said. What's that? A life without hiding, without shame, without fear of who's watching. Victoria closed her eyes, a tear sliding down her cheek. And what do you want from me? She asked. Just your presence, he said. Just mornings with you beside me, and nights knowing I can hold you without wondering if it's a dream. She smiled, her voice catching. That sounds like everything. The magnolia tree stood just as it had 40 years ago. Weathered, quiet, loyal. Its branches stretched wide above the garden, casting dappled shadows over the stone bench beneath it. Petals drifted like soft snow through the air, a gentle breeze stirring the spring grass. There were no rows of chairs, no aisle, no officiant in robes or guest in silk. Only a linen-draped table bearing a single bouquet of white lilacs and a delicate wooden box that held 2 simple rings. And them. Victoria stood beneath the tree, the hem of her cream dress fluttering around her ankles. Her silver-streaked hair had been coiled into a low twist, loose curls framing her face. No veil, no lace, just elegance and presence. The quiet beauty of a woman who had lived deeply, loved bravely, and returned by choice, not circumstance. Jietang stood opposite her in a linen suit the color of soft stone, his boutonniere a sprig of camellia, her favorite. They had told no one, no announcements, no photos for the papers, because this moment wasn't for the world. It was for them, and for everything they'd carried and lost to get here. The wind quieted as he took her hand. I never thought I'd stand here, she whispered, voice trembling slightly. Jietang smiled. I never stopped imagining it. They stood in silence for a moment, hands clasped, foreheads nearly touching. Then he gently pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket. It's old, he said, but it's still true. She smiled softly. I still remember mine, too. They stepped a little closer. He began, voice steady, low. I wrote these words when I was 20 and kept them with me ever since. Victoria, if I could give you anything, it would be peace, the kind that stays even when the world falls apart. You are my stillness, my clarity. When I lost you, I learned what emptiness truly was. I cannot promise perfect days or flawless years, but I promise presence. I promise truth. I promise that you will never again wonder whether you are loved. Not even time could undo what I felt for you. His voice broke on the last line, but he didn't look away. Victoria squeezed his hand, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. She drew in a trembling breath and began. Jietang, I used to dream of this moment, and then I stopped dreaming because I thought it would never come. I buried it like I buried so many pieces of myself. But even in the silence, I remembered. I remembered how you held my name like a prayer. I have lived a whole life between then and now, but this is the part I choose. And this time, she paused, her voice breaking. This time, I believe you. They stood in the hush of it all, time holding its breath. He reached into the wooden box and took the simpler of the two rings. No diamond, just a brushed gold band. He slid it onto her finger with both hands, and then she did the same for him. There was no, you may kiss the bride, only stillness and love. Jietang stepped closer and cupped her face with both hands. Victoria leaned into his touch, eyes fluttering closed. And then, in the silence of their garden, beneath the tree that had watched them fall in love, fall apart, and find their way back, they kissed, not like young lovers, not with hunger, but with reverence, with every year, every heartbreak, every buried word rising like breath between them. It wasn't a beginning, it was a return. Later, they sat on the stone bench beneath the tree, sipping tea and sharing slices of honeyed almond cake. Birds sang above them. The sun peeked through the branches, soft and golden. And for the first time in 4 decades, they were no longer waiting. They were no longer grieving. They were simply together, hand in hand, rings on fingers, and hearts, finally, at rest. 10 years later, the air smelled of cinnamon and wind. The leaves had turned golden again, flame-tipped and weightless, dancing on the breeze as they floated across the garden path. Autumn had settled gently on the countryside, coating every tree, every blade of grass in memory. And beneath it all, hand in hand, walked Victoria and Jietang. He wore a deep brown coat and carried a small thermos of tea. His hair, now fully silver, was combed back, his eyes still sharp with quiet joy. She wore a knitted shawl over a linen dress and soft boots that crunched over the leaves with every step. They moved slowly, not because age had dulled them, but because they had nothing to rush toward, or from. This time in their lives wasn't about achieving or proving. It was about being, about presence. They walked the garden path toward the small orphanage at the edge of the estate. Once a forgotten house, now restored, repainted, alive. Laughter echoed from its playground. A dozen children, bundled in warm jackets, were chasing each other in circles, weaving through trees like little autumn spirits. Their shoes kicked up leaves in bright bursts. One of them, a boy no older than 8, ran toward Jietang, a wooden airplane in his hand. "Uncle Lee!" he shouted. Jietang crouched with a soft groan and caught the boy mid-run. "Careful," he smiled. "That plane might fly too fast today." Victoria laughed behind him. "You spoil them." "Only the ones who deserve it," he replied, winking. She stepped forward and kissed the top of the boy's head before he scampered off again. They stood there for a moment, watching the children play. Their hands stayed linked. Their breathing was slow, matched. "This feels like the life we never thought we'd have," Victoria said, eyes on the horizon. "It is," Jietang replied, "and still somehow, the one I always imagined." She smiled, gently leaning her head on his shoulder. "They love you, you know. The kids." He hummed. "They love you more." "Of course they do," she teased, elbowing him gently. "I bring cookies." "And I fund their library," he said with mock sternness. "But sure, let's call it even." They both laughed. It was easy now. Laughter, trust, time. They walked a little further down the garden, toward the magnolia tree. The initials on the bark had faded just a little more, worn by wind and seasons. But the love that etched them, that had only grown deeper. Victoria sat on the bench and opened the journal she now carried again. Once closed in grief, now filled with entries that ended in gratitude. October 12th. The leaves are falling again, but this time, so is the fear. The past doesn't haunt me anymore. It holds me, and it has led me here, to a life I never thought I'd live, with a man who still looks at me like I'm made of light. Jietang read over her shoulder, silent. When she finished, he kissed the crown of her head. "You still write beautifully," he murmured. "You still read everything over my shoulder," she quipped. He chuckled. And then they sat in the quiet, letting the sun warm their hands, their backs, their bones. Some love stories don't end. They just wait, through silence, through pride, through years and lives and what could have been. Some love stories don't burn out. They become embers, glowing quietly until the wind stirs them again. And when autumn comes again, they rise. The wind picks up. Leaves scatter in a gust of gold and orange. Victoria and Jietang rise from the bench. They walk forward together, step by step, hand in hand. Two silver-haired lovers, smiling like youth was never something lost, only something remembered. Not in the past, but in the present, still burning, still alive, still theirs. Many wonderful years later, Victoria found it one evening in early winter. She was looking for her scarf, her favorite one, soft and pale blue, the one Jietang always said brought out the warmth in her eyes. The drawer was stuck, swollen from the cold, but she tugged gently until it gave. Inside, nestled beside a tin of her favorite tea and a photograph of the garden bench, was a small cream envelope, unsealed. Her name was written on the front in his careful, steady hand. "Victoria, to be read when I am no longer beside you." Her heart paused, then beat once, and again. She sat on the edge of their bed, the light soft, the house quiet. She opened the envelope. "My dearest Victoria, if you are reading this, it means I've gone before you. That thought is the only one that ever made me afraid in these later years. Not death, not illness. Just the idea of leaving you to finish our days without my hand in yours. I write this not in sorrow, but in deep, quiet joy, because I want you to know something, even if I'm not here to say it again. Loving you has been the only true thing I have ever done. Before you, I was an heir, a name, a function. With you, I became a man, a soul, a heart capable of longing. I want you to remember, Not the time we lost, but the time we were given. The mornings we watched the sun rise over tea. The letters you started writing again. The children who ran into your arms like you were the safest place in the world. I watched you age with grace and fire. I watched you become the woman you were always meant to be, and I was privileged to be part of that story. I've often asked myself, would I change anything? Go back and fight harder? Perhaps. But if changing the past meant risking the quiet perfection of the way you looked at me under that magnolia tree, I wouldn't change a thing. You gave me a second life. You gave me home. If there is another side to this world, I will be waiting there, on a bench, in a garden, beneath a tree we once carved into when we were too young to know what forever meant. This time, I'll hold your seat, with everything I am. Jietang. Victoria folded the letter slowly. Her hands trembled, but she didn't cry. Instead, she tucked it back into the drawer beside the tea and whispered, "You're still here." Then she stepped outside, wrapped in her pale blue scarf, and walked to the garden. The magnolia tree stood steady in the cold wind, and beneath it she sat, smiling, waiting, not in grief, but in love. The end.